Well, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning. My name is Barry Lind, and I'm the Executive Director of the Open Markets Institute in Washington. And on behalf of William Hines, the Director of the New Approaches to Economic Challenges Initiative at the OECD, and Julian Karaguzian, Special Advisor for Finance at the Government of Canada, I welcome you to Shockproof, Building Resilient International Systems in the 21st Century. The COVID-19 pandemic is a terrifying reminder of our personal fragility and the fragility of our societies. Many of us have lost someone dear. Every one of us knows many whose lives have been harshly disrupted by the economic crisis. But the COVID-19 crisis is more than a collection of personal tragedies. It is also a shocking demonstration of the fragility of our most important human-made systems. Much of the crisis we face today is due entirely to avoidable failures of industrial systems we rely on for basic goods and services. Rather than buffer the inevitable disruptions of a pandemic, these systems were structured in ways that made the pandemic and the economic disruptions far worse than they needed to be. One result was a Hobbesian struggle among nations and peoples for basic medical items, a struggle that has resulted in gross inefficiencies, vast inequalities, unnecessary deaths, and lingering distrust and even rage against near neighbors. A second result, as we will see, was that an entirely predictable event took us to the edge of cascading and potentially catastrophic industrial crashes. Our main question today is, can we build truly resilient international systems able to withstand any reasonably conceivable shock? And can we do so in ways that will also promote peaceful cooperation across borders and true innovation that promotes the material and political well-being of all people? One specific set of questions today will focus on this role played by consolidation, or more simply, the role of the monopolist and the mercantilist in creating this problem. Pascal Lamy, as you all know, was a leader of the last era of internationalism as Director General of the WTO. I spoke to Mr. Lamy the other day, and he cut straight to the core. We cannot produce everything in one factory or in one country. We should have at least 4, and those 4 must be spread around the world. We must build a different global system, Mr. Lamy said. Exactly. And in a sense, that is the conversation we begin today. We have a lot to cover. We have 3 hours, and we have 2 presentations, we have 3 panels, and we have a wrap-up session. We have a truly excellent lineup of experts on industrial systems, on competition policy, and on the engineering of international systems. This includes Congressman David Cicilline, chair of the House Antitrust Subcommittee on Antitrust in the US Congress. It includes Paul Romer, the Nobel-winning economist who's taken a lead in looking at the effects of economic concentration. And it includes Rana Foroohar, the fantastic columnist at the Financial Times, who is also author of Don't Be Evil and Makers and Takers. So we must keep things moving today. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Gabriela Ramos. Gabriela is the OECD Chief of Staff, and she is the organization's liaison to the G20. But Gabriela is also something even more important than that. Gabriela is a true leader, able to bring together the great traditions of an incredibly important organization, the OECD, which had played such a vital role in promoting the prosperity and the peace of the world for these last many years, these many decades. And Gabriela combines that with real and strong support for the new thinking on systems. So I'm going to pass it on the conversation to Gabriela.
I'm unmuted, so thank you so much, Barry, and thank you so much for everybody to joining us. After that presentation, Barry, I'm very shy at speaking. But I'm really, it's our pleasure to host this event with the Open Markets Institute. I think that Barry and his colleagues and all of you have been advancing a very interesting thinking on how this is structured, the economic structures deliver fragilities or deliver soundness in our global economy. In the new approaches to economic challenges, that is the program at the OECD that is hosting this event, we have been really trying to look for out-of-the-box thinking to get away from established truths in terms of how the economy operates and how it delivers the services that it requires. And the COVID pandemic show us the shortcomings of those thinking and the shortcomings of many of the economic analysis that we have been advancing. NAEC was created after the financial crisis, but I have to tell you that last year in 2019, we held a conference called Averting Systemic Collapse. And I was really thinking that it was a little bit extreme, that name, but now it has proven right. And I'm joined also by Laurence Boone, who is our chief economist, William Hines, who heads the NAEC, and I'm so glad that you are joining us. The pandemic illustrates most basic features of complex systems, which is what we are trying to advance. For example, interconnectedness brings benefits, but it also means that a shock to one system can cause cascading failures in others, and we're living that today. The health crisis in a Chinese province quickly became a global economic and social crisis. And I just was in the ministerial meeting of employment of the G20, and the impact has been just unprecedented. Contrary to the ideas of traditional economics, complex systems are inherently unstable. They generate shocks themselves and they don't return to previous equilibrium. There is no equilibrium. One reality is that if anything is certain, is that everything is the radical uncertainty of the things we are dealing with, and that we need to recognize. The systems are not only complex, they are adaptive. They are constantly reorganizing themselves in reaction to what their own components and other systems are doing, the famous feedback loops. Natural ecosystems, for example, react to changes in land use, bringing wild animals and their viruses into closer contact with the humans, and therefore with their habitats. And we know that. So all these systems are being together. NAEC, as I said, champions more accurate ways of analyzing complex adaptive systems. We are now in the midst of this systemic upheaval foreshadowed by this conference that we launched the year before, but that is also bringing together the thinking of many institutes, including Barry and including the universities that are joining us today, the policymakers that are joining us today, to really look at different ways of handling these harmful effects. Simply warning about impending catastrophes is not enough. We have to propose approaches to dealing with them. This means first admitting that important systems might fail and preparing to deal with the future. Here, another system characteristic is central: resilience, the ability of a system to plan and prepare for, absorb and withstand, and recover from and adapt to adverse events and disruptions. We all talk about resilience, but we have not been able to build that resilience in the systems that now are collapsing in front of our eyes. Nobody would argue against resilience, of course, but one lesson we have learned in NAEC is less welcome. There is a trade-off between resilience and efficiency. And I think efficiency has been the predominant objective in many of our policy choices. Cutting the number of hospital beds and staff might make a health system more efficient and lean, but at the price of less resilience. Slack is not a welcome concept in traditional economic analysis, but we might need it to confront it with this very impressive shock that we are living today. Linked to the efficiency is optimization. In NAEC, we call on a range of disciplines, not just economics. Engineers and physicists tell us that when you are trying to optimize a complex system, you might end up destabilizing it. For the economic system, Barry has illustrated how the concentration of power in a small number of global corporations may have improved efficiency in specific domains and circumstances, but over-reliance on a few actors has undermined the resilience of the economic system as a whole. And this is exactly what we want to discuss today. Concentration of wealth and power is a fact of today's economy, with 80% of the corporate value housed in 10 corporations. And this has a wide systemic impact. Paul Krugman and Larry Summers link growing monopoly power to weak growth, while Jason Furman and Peter Orszag argue that monopoly has contributed to inequality. It also damages entrepreneurship. And of course, we are limiting here to the economic concepts and to the economic analysis. But if we go from system to system, the social, the economics, the politics, we are really getting into the hardcore of why we have this populist expression all around our countries in terms of people not finding their way and just getting very extreme outcomes in the political processes. Today, we are discussing what happened to production networks, why it happened, and what could be done in the future to create shock-proof systems. The answer is not localization or anti-globalization, even though we are perceiving that that's a trend now, but at least part of the answer must be anti-monopolization. And for many institutions, including the OECD, which has traditionally emphasized the need for efficiency, it's not easy to accept that we should build slack, buffers, and spare capacities into our systems, especially when countries face fiscal constraint after the current crisis. But as we now see, this is literally a question of life or death. And therefore, we need to have open mind. We need to look at what works and what doesn't, and don't stick to whatever we think was the best analytical frameworks, but to move forward and get better answers for the people that are looking for it nowadays. So we welcome this seminar. We welcome partnering with Barry and the Open Market Institute. And I think that we will be contributing to the rethinking of these systems and ensure that they are sustainable and deliver for people. And it could not have been more timely. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, so we're terrifically happy to have with us today Paul Romer, who is someone I've gotten to know over the last couple of years. And Paul is as you know, is one of the more brilliant economists in the world. He's also someone who has taken a real understanding of the role that concentration has played in disrupting our society and our complex system. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul now.
Thank you, Barry. It's great to be here. This is obviously an extraordinarily timely discussion in the midst of this catastrophic failure that we're experiencing right now. When you think about the underlying problems that lead to these systemic failures, one source that economists emphasize that is indeed important is opportunism. People will take advantage of opportunities to do something that's privately beneficial but harmful to society. We need a collective capacity for fencing that in and keeping people from being too opportunistic in ways that are harmful for everyone else. A way to think about how this leads to brittleness and fragility is to think of financial sectors where people cynically would joke about selling options that pay off when the world collapses. You collect a stream of income in normal times. Purchasers think they're buying insurance for some terrible event, but then the terrible event happens and you don't have to pay off because you're in the midst of a crisis. The acronym that people on Wall Street used to refer to this was IBG, YBG. I'll be gone, you'll be gone, don't worry about it. It'll be somebody else's problem. So we do need to have policies that anticipate opportunism and fence it in. But there's another problem that we need to keep in mind. It's the kind of problem that the behavioral economists would emphasize. And this is just inexperience. Many people who have not had experience with something underestimate the potential for it to happen. It's the problem I've spent most of my career focusing on is that if people aren't familiar with some good possibility, they often have trouble believing that it's possible. And so they refuse to try and they deny the possibility of genuine improvements that are feasible. There's a downside version of this as well, which is that people can get complacent and failed to take seriously the possibility that things as they exist now could collapse if some shock hits the system. So we need some way to keep exposing people, keep giving them experience with both the good possibilities and these risky negative ones. Evidence that this matters shows up, for example, when you look at states which suffered from the savings and loan crisis in that started in 1980s and ran into the 1990s. Those states with the worst experience with the savings and loan crisis had less disruption during the housing crisis of 2008-9 because the regulatory systems, the behavior of all the decision makers had been primed by this intense experience with the problem in the recent past. Right now, we see that nations in Asia that had to deal with SARS before have been better at responding to the current pandemic because they had recent experience with it. So the public policy analog that we should think about is something we can borrow from Netflix. Netflix created what they called their chaos monkey, which was basically software that would go in and artificially break links and break systems that were running. They would go in and say, okay, this server's broken, this router doesn't work anymore, and it would literally break their system so that they could find out, were the backups effective? Could they actually keep going if a server failed, if a disk failed, if a router failed? So this constant experience with failure forced them to have systems that truly were robust. And we should think about, as public policy measures, how to force that kind of discipline on critical suppliers, critical parts of our economy. Now, one thing we know will be essential for this is choice. If our public policy is that we offer some rewards to some system, like a pharmaceutical producer, we offer some reward for participating, but as a part of that, they have to show that they can keep operating if, for example, the government says, okay, you can no longer buy from this supplier for the next month or two. You can't use that supplier, but show me that you can keep running. In exchange, we could offer certain kinds of insurance, as we do offer to these firms. But for this to work, that firm has to have a choice. If there's a single monopoly supplier of a particular input into the pharmaceutical manufacturing process, it's pointless to have the government try and go through a drill where they force the pharmaceutical firm to show that they can switch to another supplier. No other supplier will exist. If we were running the chaos monkey, it would create some demand for other suppliers so people could prove they can use other suppliers. But we have to think about other policies like antitrust policy that make sure that single firms don't take over entire functions in our society. And we've got to be clever about how those policies work. I was part of the Department of Justice case against Microsoft. I saw how that worked. I'm very skeptical that antitrust enforcement through our judicial system in the United States will lead to any kind of structural remedies like the breakup of firms, even in cases like the Microsoft case where there was a clear finding of legal liability. So we need to be creative about other ways to encourage choice. One that I've been suggesting is to use taxes. We could just say that when a firm gets big enough, we're going to tax it more heavily, a kind of a progressive revenue tax or employment tax or scale tax on firms so that there's an economic incentive for that one big firm to split itself into different parts, to spin out different units, to minimize its tax bill. The other measure that I think we should be thinking about more aggressively is a public option. If there are firms that provide critical services, critical communication services, then we should have government backup systems that people can turn to if the private system fails. So think about Facebook as a communication system. Think about Gmail as a critical node in our communication system. The government should think about not necessarily supplanting them as suppliers of services, but at least of offering an alternative that people could switch to if they're unhappy with what they're getting from those market sources. And if something goes wrong and those dominant suppliers can't continue to do their job, there at least will be a structure we can scale up that can start to take over. So I think these public options as backups, as part of our system of resilience, need to be an intrinsic part of our thinking about creating the kind of choice that you need for a competitive market to work the way it's supposed to work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I think that your comment make way for a fantastic entry for our next speaker, who I'm very pleased to welcome, Congressman David Cicilline. Congressman Cicilline serves as Rhode Island 1st Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he has a long-standing career in different positions in Congress, advancing very important initiatives to improve the well-being of American people. He is one of the House's most active members with tremendous experience on very wide range of topics, from foreign affairs to healthcare and climate change. But he's also a champion for equality and has promoted the improvement of minimum wages, access to healthcare, again, very topical, defending LGBT rights, and taking decisions to ensure that middle classes have a chance, for example, to buy their houses, to send their children to schools and quality schools, and to be protected in retirement. Mr. Congressman, we applaud your activities. At the OECD, we have an inclusive growth initiative that cut across all areas of work to ensure that the bottom share of the income distribution in our societies is not left behind. And we now know that they will be the hardest hit from the COVID crisis. And today we will benefit from your experience and insights as chairman of the House Antitrust Subcommittee, where you oversee a very broad portfolio. I will not describe it because I'd rather have you, Mr. Congressman, sharing your thoughts and your wisdom with this group.
Good morning, and thank you, Gabrielle, for that nice introduction. It's a pleasure to join all of you today for this discussion on strengthening our international systems in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. I want to start by thanking Barry Lynn for his leadership at the Open Markets Institute and for holding today's briefing. I'd also like to thank Professor Paul Romer, a Nobel laureate and a pioneer in the field of economics, for making today's event possible and for raising the alarm about the economic dangers posed by monopolies throughout his career. And lastly, I want to acknowledge our colleagues at the OECD, and in particular, their new approaches to economic challenges initiative, which has also been active on these issues. I'm sorry I'm not able to participate on any of the excellent panel discussions today. As you can see, I'm back in Washington to vote on legislation to increase emergency funding for our nation's small businesses and hospitals that are on the front lines of this pandemic. It goes without saying that I wish we were doing more to help Americans get back on their feet. Locally owned businesses are the economic engine of our country, and it's essential that to the success of our communities that they survive this crisis. And that's why we've been pressing hard to make sure that we support our communities and move as quickly as we can to defeat this virus through rapid testing and other measures that will allow businesses to reopen safely. Additionally, as Congress continues to respond to this crisis, it's imperative that we also address some of the issues that have hamstrung our response to the pandemic. This crisis has laid bare the necessity of producing goods in this country that are critical to the health and safety of Americans. People on the front lines of combating this deadly virus, our heroes, do not have the materials they need to do their jobs safely. We have to fix this problem. This starts by acting swiftly to secure and diversify our supply chains for essential products, ensuring that America is no longer dependent on a single nation for any critical good, and strengthening our investment in domestic manufacturing. We need to move things home, especially items that are critical to our healthcare system, like the production of personal protective equipment. Good-paying manufacturing jobs are also essential to rebuilding our middle class and reclaiming our identity as a leading center of manufacturing and innovation. We also need to improve international coordination, even while we do more to make it in America. Competition policy also has a role to play in promoting our economic recovery. As millions of businesses struggle to stay afloat, private equity firms and dominant corporations are positioned to swoop in for a buying spree. According to industry reports, private equity firms have been sitting on $2.5 trillion of investor cash, while dominant technology firms have over $570 billion in cash and investments. Top industry consultants are also already advising their corporate clients that the current landscape of distressed assets presents, and I quote, unique opportunities to invest, end quote. And although merger activity has temporarily slowed, industry analysts are already beginning to forecast an acceleration of deal making that may hasten economic concentration across the board. And that is why, along with several of my colleagues, I am pushing for a moratorium on merger activity as part of the upcoming stimulus package that is CARES 2. Mega mergers and corporate takeovers that were permitted during the last economic crisis led to the firing of millions of workers, the slowing of investment and innovation, and huge increases in executive compensation. As we respond to the current crisis with millions of Americans facing unemployment and millions of businesses in severe economic distress, we cannot afford to repeat this mistake. If we do not act boldly and urgently to respond to this problem, consolidation may further weaken our economy by concentrating wealth and control at the expense of workers and independent business across the country. And this will have lasting consequences. And that's why I strongly believe that we must take immediate action to halt this trend by including a moratorium in the upcoming stimulus package on all transactions that do not involve firms that are truly failing or in bankruptcy. This is not complicated. Our country can leave room for merger activity that is necessary to ensuring that distressed firms have a fresh start through the bankruptcy process or through necessary divestitures, while also ensuring that we do not undergo another period of rampant and unhealthy consolidation. Our country has already had a moratorium on union formation in the wake of this pandemic. It is unthinkable that we would allow mega mergers and private equity takeovers during this crisis. Moreover, our nation's antitrust enforcers should be focusing and maximizing their resources to improve and protect American lives. They should be doing everything possible to police conduct that harms competition and consumers, such as price gouging, hoarding, collusion to suppress wages, and other anti-competitive and anti-consumer conduct. The last thing our country needs right now is expending valuable resources in response to a wave of mega mergers during a time of crisis. Targeting non-compete clauses should also be a top priority. Tens of millions of Americans have already been laid off, and we cannot allow these oppressive contractual terms to keep people from finding another job. Addressing this problem will be critical to helping Americans during recovery. And so again, I thank you for including me in today's discussion. I apologize in advance for not being able to participate more fully in today's event, and I look forward very much to hearing from each of the panelists on these important topics, and thank you again for the invitation.